Hello and welcome to a Perun style video on the lore, layout, and locomotives of yet another attempt of me trying to give Gensokyo a steam-powered railway. This time, it's different. This time, we're looking at the Makai, Village, and Genbu Light Railway. So let's get started. Here, we'll be discussing the creation and history of the MV&GLR. We'll be looking at its locomotive stock, notable features and characters, as well as a timetable and a list of railway services, as well as a map and layout, but, you know, that's that. So, let's start off with the history. To which we will now go to 1950s era Gensokyo. The genesis for the railway started way back in the early 1950s. A safe route for transport was needed in 1952 when food security concerns were found in the human village, mostly because of the yokai being out in the woods, being out in the plains, and they like to eat and kill humans, which is a problem where if a yokai incident were to occur and if it lasts long enough, there could be a food shortage within the human village. However, that was not the only thing going on at the time. The Kappa Valley's industrial base was growing by the day and needed to access new markets. Therefore, something had to be done, as the road system in Gensokyo is very crude and rudimentary and not really great for the transport of heavy goods. However, the Zanzu Shimigami also wanted to expand into the freight market because there's only so many dead spirits you can ferry across the Zanzu River before the market got crowded, you know. There's only a limited amount of people dying by the day to be able to make a lot of money off of that. And with the increasing amount of Shinigami, they decided that they wanted to haul less than dead, but also less than alive stuff. You know, like general goods, coal, wood, you know, the commodities. They wanted to expand into the commodity market. So, a variety of people, some representing the Shinigami, some representing the humans, and some represented the Kappa, decided to consult one of the sages of Gensokyo, Yukari Yakumo, and she proposes a novel new concept for Gensokyo to get behind, known as the railway. After explaining what a railway was, she decided to build a small test line connecting a local coal mine to Kappa Valley. This was to demonstrate the power of the locomotive, using a preserved London and Northwestern Railway 18-inch goods, otherwise known as a cauliflower, and I'm going to refer to it as a cauliflower, because that's its nickname, and it just rolls off the tongue a lot better than 18-inch goods, and thus, in one fell swoop, proved the feasibility of a railway. After that was done, she consulted Ran, her Shikigami, and told her to survey a route through across Gensokyo. Thus, she managed to find a route between Kappa Valley, connecting a village full of yokai, a small hamlet known as Magician's Road, as well as the human village, the Hakurai Shrine, before terminating at Makai, which had largely been just a small gathering of humans and yokai. The portal to Makai had since been sealed up, and had been sealed up for many years. So it was just more of an antiquated thing at this point. But the railway terminated there, as well as finding a route connecting Yente to the Zanzu River, where a harbor was to be built. However, while Ran was surveying this route, internal crowdfunding was being done by Yukari. Many people, such as humans and yokai alike, even some business leaders, came together and donated money to build the railway, the largest of which was the Hakurai Shrine, which caused the shrine to fall into a heavy debt, and thus has had financial difficulties ever since then. Construction began in 1954 when the funds had been secured, but only between Kappa Valley and the human village, thus constituting Phase 1 of railway construction. Once Phase 1 had largely been complete by 1956, freight operations began in order to build up funds to build the Zanzu branch line. However, In order to build the rest of the railway, Yukari had to look outside for investment, and thus invested in a lot of shady businesses in the Japanese mainland, which luckily turned out to be successful investments and were used to fund the railway's construction and became a alternative source of revenue which subsidized a lot of the railway's stuff. This is going to be very important later on, so keep that in mind. Phase 2 was constructed from Makai, ending at the human village, finishing the main line. And by 1958, the railway was fully operational with its first passenger trains being rostered. Motive power. So, most of the locomotives operated on the railway are owned by Yukari Yakumo, who is a secret preservationist, and thus has a large collection of steam locomotives that she keeps somewhere. It is unknown where she keeps them, it's unknown how she maintains them. All we know is that Yukari has some steam engines, and thus most of the smaller ones were on permanent loan to the MV&GLR. However, some of these locomotives were not enough, and thus additional examples had to be built at the railway workshops in Kappa Valley when requested. The works were established in 1954, with motive power depots being built at either end of the line in 54 and 56. However, the Zanzu branch line was the last of the railway to be built. Well, the last of the initial railway to be built. We'll get into that later. Construction started in 1960, and the Shinigamis were not pleased in the slightest. The reason being is largely because they were promised it would be finished as part of the initial railway construction. However, funding problems came about, and thus the railway had to delay the construction of the Zanzu branch. However, Yukari did pay the Shinigami, a pension of some sort to hold them over until the line was completed. However, building this line also meant building through the bamboo forest of the Lost. And this created problems, mostly because as soon as the bamboo was cut, more would grow in its place. However, this led to the creation of a defoliant, which was used to coat the track bed, which allowed the bamboo to not grow in the middle of the track, and helped construction. However, because of this, the line's completion was delayed until 1964. The railway managed to grow and started to benefit Gensokyo, creating an economic gold age which lasted until the early 1990s, which is not surprising knowing where Gensokyo is, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Humans benefited from having a fast and safe way to travel and not have to deal with yokai raids of any sort. The yokai were benefited with more work opportunities and being able to, own a home, buy food, yokai stuff. And the Hakurai Shrine's popularity was improved, but because of their debts to the railway's investment, they would suffer financially and continue to do so until this day. And if you ever wonder why Reimu was poor, this is why. It is largely because of her great-grandmother. And technically her grandmother, but mostly her great-grandmother. However, the railway did not go smoothly. The worst rail disaster happened in 1973 with the Hakurai New Year's wreck, which was caused by a class of locomotive which was found to be insufficient. This involves explaining that the railway had ex-London Brighton South Coast Railway B1s, which is an 042 design of passenger locomotive. By the 70s, the B1s had been relegated as spare engines as they were found to have insufficient power and thus required a lot of sand to accelerate from stations, only for drivers and crews alike to find that they had insufficient braking capacity. However, in 1973, on New Year's Day, a B1 was allocated to a stopping special train which stopped at the Hakurai Shrine Station. The incident happened because the crew, having left the human village station, had run out of sand, and due to the icy conditions, had difficulty stopping, or rather grip. And when the train managed to move at a steady pace, in fact, they were speeding, mostly because they were late and needed to make up time. However, they were distracted, and a SPAD incident occurred, and SPAD standing for signal passed at danger. Basically, they passed a red signal. And once they realized their error, it was too late. The brakes were applied, the tender brake was applied, but due to the icy rails and the inertia of the heavy train, they collided into the back of the three rearmost carriages, causing the last one to telescope into the second carriage of the consist, including the death of the crew and the station staff, as well as the passengers who were boarding the train at the time. 43 people lost their lives, humans and yokai alike. However, because of the tenuous relationship between death and Shintoism, by order of Reimu's grandmother, she ordered that the station be closed, and the human village had decided to investigate the railway for safety-related issues. Passenger traffic dipped severely because humans thought the railway was too unsafe and that the yokai were being yokai again. So, an investigation was led by a rather young, or relatively young, Kin Kamiwa Shirasawa, and she appointed some humans who actually knew about trains and investigated the railway. They realized several things. One, there was no train protection system involved. So if a train passed a signal at danger, it was completely up to the volition of the crew to actually stop the disaster. And even yokai are flawed, so they're not perfect. Then there's the fact that the railway cheaped out and used wood in the construction of their carriages. Usually you're supposed to use steel when you build passenger coaches because it makes them more robust, it makes them more resistant to impacts. Overall, it makes for a safer carriage, so that was an issue. And so, several people were indicted and some people were arrested and charged. This included the yard foreman who allocated the B1, several railway executives who failed to withdraw the B1s, instead putting them on spare engine status, and even the chief mechanical engineer was arrested. However, Yukari was indicted, as she was the general manager / controller at the time, but because doing so would create a nasty precedent that would give the yokai a casus belli to attack the human village, and especially considering there's a direct rail line from the yokai populations into the human village, the humans decided to just let that one slide. The charges were later dropped as part of a reconciliation package / agreement that was made with Yukari Yakumo in the 1980s, alongside financial compensation to the families of the victims. This also led to an adoption of TPWS, which was initially invented in Gensokyo, albeit in a slightly more crude fashion. The design would later be leaked to British Rail in the 1990s, which they would later refine into their own version of Train Protection Warning System, or TPWS, which was co-developed by Ran Yakumo, who was the deputy controller at the time. She was also Yukari Shikigami, so, there's that. And there were more incidents, but these are the last of the really fatal incidents. So, in 1978, human engine crews were being trialed. Up until then, it was only yokai who drove the engines, because it was only the yokai that really understood the locomotives and what they were capable of. Humans in Gensokyo, even after 20 or so years of exposure to steam locomotives, they, by and large, still didn't understand the damn things, so why bother? But they decided to change their stance, and a small group of humans were hired to be drivers and firemen. However, one particular human had a very magical thinking of how steam engines operated, thinking it was powered by yokai magic. Thus, this led to an incident where a London Northwestern Railway cauliflower was... Well, here's the incident. The cauliflower was pulling a slow goods and had exited Magician's Road. However, the driver decided not to fill the tender full of water again, so thinking that, oh, it's yokai magic, it'll be fine. However, they were running late, and that was also another reason why they didn't refill the tender with water. And once they got outside of the station limits, the boiler exploded because the crown sheet had failed, and this killed the driver and the fireman. After an investigation was led by the railway, it was found that the human crew was at fault, and this led to the pausing of the trials. Albeit by pausing, I mean they didn't hire any more humans. Human crew trials were ended in 1982 after a SPAD incident in which an express train collided with the rear end of a slow goods train, killing the guard in the brake van. These humans were either fired or were reallocated to less technical roles, such as porters and office staff. However, deep within the Yokai mountain range, a village full of Oni was established in the late 1960s, and by the 1980s had requested a special rail connection. Thus, from 1983 to 1985, the line was extended from Kappa Valley to Oni's End, leading to the construction of the railway's first tunnel. There was also a stone quarry, which the Oni had worked, and an industrial line was also built to accommodate stone traffic. However, all good things must come to an end, and the Japanese economy crashing during the 1990s caused a lot of issues for the railway, mostly because those shady investments Yukari had made in the 1950s were made up largely of the most rotten institutions within the Japanese economy, and thus the lost decades, which this period would be known as, largely destroyed a lot of those bad companies. Thus, the railway lost a majority of its profits. Thus, the railway suffered financially during the majority of the 90s. Staffing cuts, fares were raised, services were cut, corners were being cut, except for maintenance, which the railway board fucking hated because they wanted to cut costs wherever, but Yukari Yakumo once stared them down and used her basically her stance as one of the most powerful yokai in Gensokyo, and to tell them no, and that deferring maintenance would be the death of the railway. So, yeah. However, these lean years were largely solved through yokai human currency reforms, leading to the decimalization of the koban. The koban, or koban coins, were a small, medium, maybe large-sized coin that was used to buy a year's worth of rice. However, currency reforms were needed to devalue the coin itself, as well as to revalue the precious metals that the coin was made of, so that way the railway would have more money. That and Ran Yakumo was put in charge of railway sectorization, where the railway's various freight and passenger operations were split off into separate sub-organizations, just as British Rail had done in the 1980s. Thus, the railway managed to regain profitability in 2001. And now that brings us to the events of the Windows era. So here's the thing about the events of the Windows era. The games happen in the year that they are released, and only some of the games affected the railway, such as the Red Mist incident of 2002, which caused major service reductions and speed restrictions. In fact, the Red Mist was so bad that the drivers couldn't see the signals properly and couldn't tell if they were set to clear or danger. Luckily, because of the railway's installation of TPWS, all the drivers had to do was pass the signal, and if it was at danger, the train would automatically stop, and because of the speed restrictions, would stop pretty quickly. If it was line clear, then nothing would happen, and because of the speed restrictions, nothing would happen. and then a prolonged winter, as per the events of Perfect Cherry Blossom, caused a sand shortage across the railway, causing sand to be imported from Haigan at great cost, and the worst of the sand shortage happened at the Kappa Valley Motive Power Depot. Abnormal spring conditions in 2005, as per Phantasmorgia of Flower View, caused severe service disruptions as extra weed-killing trains were required to kill the weeds, which was disrupting the track bed. The emergence of Kaneko Yasaka and Suwaku Moria as new gods at the Yokai Mountain caused a strike at the Kappa Valley Motive Power Depot and railway works. A Yokai rebellion, as per Double Dealing Character, caused a railway-wide strike, which caused temporary closure. Big F. Seasonal problems causes delays and speed restrictions in 2017, and 2 separate beast spirit invasions caused some minor to major trouble. The first one in 2019 didn't really affect the railway much. However, most of the beast spirits weren't aware of the railway being built. So, a beast spirit wandered onto the track and was hit by an express goods train that was heading to Zanzu Harbor. The railway did award the beast spirits' surviving family members with financial compensation, seeing how one of their friends got splattered by a goods train that was going at the railway's maximum highest speed, which is about 55 miles an hour. However, the second beast spirit, caused by the expansion of the markets, with the beast spirits being aware of the railway, led to the railway's corporate offices being raided, leading to an armed standoff by railway police. Several were killed, exterminated, and the rest were arrested. And now, onto the more important characters of the railway. Here is Yukari Yakumo. She is a founding member of the MV&GLR and has been the current controller and general manager of the railway since 1954. She also served as chief mechanical engineer from 1961 to 1966 and personally oversaw the rebuilds of the railway's ex-London Brighton South Coast Railway E2s and E2Xs. She's also a senior member of the railway board and has been for the longest time ever. Ran Yakumo was chief surveyor of the rail line. Her services as such were no longer needed after the railway's initial completion, and has been the deputy controller since 1965, when the position was first created. She oversaw sectorization in the 1990s and co-developed TPWS. Hidori Kawashio was chief mechanical engineer since 2014 and had embarked on major modernization efforts on the railway. She transitioned the railway to centralized signaling, as well as replacing all the semaphores with multiple aspect signals, and instituted a program to rebuild the fleet with major upgrades, such as the implementation of LEMPOR exhausts, and has independently begun developing an offshoot of the LEMPREX ejector. And by independently, I mean the plans were stolen, and because the LEMPREX ejector system is still not finished, from what I understand, the railway has decided to work and make their own, even though it's stolen technology. Kin Kamishirasawa was guardian of the human village since the 1940s, assuming that she turned 80 in her debut, and when she debuted in Imperishable Night. Investigated railway safety practices during the 70s and had an indirect hand in TPWS development, and was appointed by village elders to handle railway matters in 1993, but resigned in 2008. Romelia Scarlett was the mastermind behind the Red Mist incident, which was very controversial. However, she became an investor of the railway and had become a railway member board by 2013, even though 2013 was a bit of a lean year due to the closures. She's unpopular amongst railway staff due to the open secret of her not treating or paying her ferry maids very well. And now to the fun part, locomotives. The first engine class to be on the railway was the London North Western Railway 18-inch goods, also known as the cauliflower. 2 examples were preserved by Yukari Yakumo, and a further 6 were built. However, after one was lost by a boiler explosion, a 7th member was built. These were then displaced from heavy goods services in the 1980s by J11s and later the K-class. All class members are still on work on the railway as of 2025. However, their replacements are pretty much past due. The E2s and the E2Xs. 2 examples of each were preserved by Yukari Yakumo during their withdrawals in the early 1960s, being purchased straight off the scrap lines. However, after Yukari had personally experienced the shortcomings of the E2s, she ordered them to be rebuilt, with her being in charge of the rebuilding process, having designed all the modifications. This included lower pressure boilers and cylinders, a modified exhaust system, and weights on the frames and running board in order to reduce the center of gravity, thus resolving a lot of the fuel inefficiency problems and the high center of gravity. However, this came at the cost of acceleration, and the locomotive still oscillated at high speeds. However, in railway operation, they never really got to the point where they would oscillate, mostly because they didn't really go all that too fast on the railway, on the services they were used. The E2 axes were allocated for Zanzu branch services, and the regular E2s were used for shunting and light goods work, as well as occasional trips to the farm co-op station, which is the goods line that directly serves the human village. All class members are still in service as of 2025. The B1s, like I mentioned, they were initially used for passenger services. However, as coaches got bigger and trains became heavier, they were redesignated as spare engines. Then they were withdrawn as per recommendations from Keen, and all surviving members were returned to Yukari's private collection. However, their current location and status is unknown. Allegedly, according to one of the other sages, Yukari had disassembled one of the ones built by the railway in 1958 to provide spare parts for the other 3 that she had. So, yeah, there's that to consider. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 978s. One example was preserved by Yukari Yakumo, with an additional 2 built in 1959. They were used on express passenger services and some stopping services, taking over from any disabled GNR N2s, and were displaced by new build D11s in 1986. They are kept for spare engines, but mostly for light stopping passenger work, and sometimes shunting, and sometimes services into Oni's End. One was withdrawn for parts due to poor condition. However, the rest are allegedly still in service, albeit in an inactive capacity. The J11/J9s of the Great Central Railway. One was preserved by Yukari, the rest were built in 1972. They were used on heavy goods trains and handled express goods trains until displaced by the K-class for Zanzu-bound fast freights. They displaced cauliflowers from heavy goods and used on rotation for daily slow goods trains. All 6 class members are still in service, but withdrawal of some members are being considered. The N2s, 2 were preserved by Yukari, and another 2 were built. They were used on stopping passenger services out of Kappa Valley and Makai, and were still in service as of 2025, but replacements are in development and will be announced at a later year. The K-class. One was preserved, the rest were built in 1975. They were used primarily on fast freight services to and from the Zanzu Harbor, used on heavy freights when needed, and because of their mixed traffic nature, were used on passenger trains, again covering for disabled or failed engines. All class members are still in service, but will be replaced by K3s, with 7 examples being under construction since 2028, and those will enter service in 2026. The D11s. 5 members were built, and replaced the 978s from service. They're used for primarily express passenger service. Sometimes they're used on other services. All class members are still in service. The J70s, or the C53s. All four were preserved by Yukari Yakumo, purchased directly from the scrap lines after being withdrawn from the Wiz Beach and Upwell Tramway, and were used for shunting and short distance work. They were originally used on farm co-op services, but were then reallocated to handle traffic from Oni's end. All three members are still in service, but one was surplus to requirement and was returned to the possession of Yukari Yakumo. The K3s, they're still under construction. They're going to enter service next year. The Great Western Railway 5700s, 11 examples preserved by Yukari Yakumo, used for shunting and short trip workings because, they're fairly robust tank engines. However, due to the financial difficulties of the 90s, 2 were sold into industrial work. All 9 are still in service, and the 2 industrial examples are also still in service. Now for the railway services. Largely the stopping services start twice daily in the morning, with a second service from opposite ends in the afternoon, early afternoon. Express trains run twice daily from Kappa Valley, with the second originating from Makai in the evening. The Riviera is a seasonal express going to the Zanzu River. The Zanzu River services being seasonal from late May to early September. Summer running. The Marathon is a special express starting at Oni's end and is a limited service. And the farming co-op only runs passenger services, but only during the harvest season because they need workers to harvest the crops. Freight services. All the freight services have largely been split between the various different sectors. One involves running the daily slow goods train, which starts in the morning, stops at every station, and the return trip back to Kappa Valley involves dropping off empty wagons. Riverlink is the sector that operates the service of the same name and is an express freight service to the Zanzu Harbor. The Condor, which is similar to the Condor of British Rail in the 60s and 70s, runs twice from Kappa Valley all the way to the Human Village, and then back again in the afternoon. Farm trains run when requested and are seasonal. Bulk coal, oil, and stone trains run as units and are run when the industries require them. Branch line services, thrice daily passenger trips from the Human Village, stopping at Yente and Lunar Village, only stopping at the Zanzu River during seasonal operating times. Slow goods start right after the mainline slow goods stops at the Human Village, originating from the goods yard before going to the smaller goods yards at the Human Village station before continuing up the line. Miscellaneous service. So these are the interesting ones. So one of which is an undocumented service required by Ikishiki. This is the Spirit Ferry service. This is an express passenger train that does not stop at any stations. In fact, it stops in the middle of the main line to taking on dead spirits, which are then taken to the Zanzu River station for them to depart and be ferried by the Shinigami to be ferried across the Zanzu River. This service operates at no cost to the dead spirits, with them only being able to pay for the trip across the river for judging in Haigan. And it's the only non-seasonal train to stop at that particular station. Then there's ambulance services, which go directly to Yente, and office trains, but that's more for official railway business. And now for a map of the railway. Here is a map of the Makai Village and Genbu Light Railway, based off of a paper map that I had drawn. Red is the main line, which starts at Kappa Valley and terminates at Makai. Magician's Road is more of a halt, but it has a small goods yard and supplies a nearby hamlet. There, as far as industries, which are indicated by green, there is a stone quarry, a coal mine, the farming co-op, the human village goods yard, and the Zanzu harbor. But there's also the Totetsu oil field, which has been under the ownership of Yuma Totetsu, and is the railway's largest source of income because crude oil sells. Who knew? Then you have the Zanzu branch line. The Lunar Village has a small station with only a minor goods line. Again, the Lunar Village serves a small colony of lunar expats, and Yente has a larger goods yard, and this is mostly to facilitate the export of pharmaceuticals and for the receiving of goods and raw materials. Oni's End should be in yellow, but I can't tell if that's green or yellow, but there's the extension. And now we've come to the end of the presentation. I know this isn't as thrilling as the defense analyzation presentations of Perun, but I'm also operating on a lack of food because I haven't eaten lunch yet. I should probably do that after I'm done filming this. But that's the Makai Village and Genbu Light Railway. I will start construction of the route in Trains 2019 in a live stream, probably after Toho Fest. I might do one before I leave, but, I'd rather play my Switch 2 and enjoy that and enjoy a nice transition into Toho Fest. But after Toho Fest, definitely, for sure, I'll be building this railway. God forbid anything else happens. Thank you, and good afternoon, or good evening, or whatever. Bye.